Hi, my friends, and welcome back to Your Inner Spark. I'm your host, Alana, and today we're joined by the founder and CEO of Habit Money, a platform that combines real human coaching with mindfulness and psychology to build healthy financial habits. Welcome, Jessica. I'm so grateful to be sitting in this conversation with you today.
Back at you. I'm so honored to be here and so excited to have this conversation with you.
I know that you have so much knowledge and nuggets to share with my audience. So before we get started, I ask every single one of my guests this question. When was the first time that you felt your inner spark, or that it could be inner spirit, inner guide, your connection to that inner knowing?
Yeah, I love that question. This will kind of get into the background of Habit Money too, but I grew up in a really small town in the middle of nowhere. I had like 42 people in my graduating class and not many people left my small. And I very early on sort of had this like, okay, if I want to go do something else, I'm really going to have to go to college and have to get this good job. And it was probably some healthy motivation, but there's this voice that started in my head of this is what you should do. And that should word, I think, actually started to become very dominant in a very unhealthy way because it was, okay, you should go to this good college. And now you're at that good college. Now you should go get a super high paying job so you can pay for said college. And that was sort of how I lived my life until I started applying to business school again, because I should do that because that's what everyone else is doing. And when I finally got to Stanford and I was lucky enough that my MBA program actually had a lot of curriculum around like finding, what speaks to you and finding your joy. And I distinctly remember taking a class that was one of it was like called The How of Happiness. And one of the things that we had to do was actually write our own obituary. And it's a really hard thing to do, but what it makes you realize is like what you want to be known for, and then therefore like what's important to you. And it just clicked for me that like I've been spending my whole life doing things that I thought I should do. And in a way, it got me to the point where now I could afford to pause and say, okay, but what do I want to do? What is the legacy I want to leave in this world? And so that I would say was my first spark of changing the way I was thinking about how I was living my life.
Wow, that is so powerful. I feel like I need to go do that exercise now of writing my own obituary.
It's
Um,
crazy.
so diving into finances stuff, because this is what we're talking about lately. Everybody knows my finances are a bit of a mess, but we're working through it. And your platform is helping me very significantly on my journey. So, can you share your background and how you got started in the business of helping people with their financial situations?
Yeah. So, oftentimes when I start talking about habit money, people are like, oh, were you working in finance or did you do, psychology as a background? And the answer is no, I'm not one of these people who had a budgeting approach that then I tried to get everyone to do. I'm actually on the other side. I'm in your camp of people who are struggling a little bit. So, I spent most of my career working in kind of the intersection of fintech and e-commerce. And going back to that spark question, I was having a moment where I was like, I'm, I'm not feeling like I'm changing lives or changing the world in the way that I want to. So I was already kind of starting to look for something that really spoke to me. And two things kind of happened simultaneously. One was I watched this documentary called Savvy with a dollar sign. And it's a really short documentary, about an hour and a half, about all the different ways that women specifically are disadvantaged when it comes to money. And, it could be the wage gap, education, how our parents talk to us, all those things. And so that pissed me off. And so I was like, okay, this annoys me. At the same time, my partner, now husband, and I were moving in together and starting to have the money talk. And it was one of the worst arguments, fights, conversations we'd ever had. It was so painful. And we kind of came to the other side of this and looked at each other and said, we like to think we're fairly well educated. We like to think we're financially literate, list all the things. Why are we struggling so much with this process? And that kind of started this sort of like customer interview process for me because I was genuinely trying to understand how does everybody else do it so much better than we do. And what I found, and this maybe you can resonate with this, is there are kind of two buckets of people. There was the bucket of people where money just made sense and it was easy for them. And so there's all these products out there to help them optimize that. But then there was kind of like the rest of us who, might know that you need to spend less and save more, and rationally it makes sense. But yet the there was a gap between what our intention was and what our actions were. And there was a lot of guilt and shame and emotions kind of piled up in a really tight knot that was kind of getting in the way. And that's where I had the aha. I was like, this is something to solve. This is not a financial literacy problem. This is not a budgeting problem. This is something much more deep and personal. And so maybe we should start thinking about money in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's so spot on. I think money is so emotional. And it's fascinating for me to think about the fact that I think a lot of us look around at other people and we think everybody else has it figured out. And we're the only ones that don't have it figured out. And that's the shame's kind of, I think, running the show a little bit, because shame is always like, no, nobody's going to understand. You're the only one in this situation. You're the only one going through this. And even with sharing my own journey, I'm discovering that it's such an emotionally charged topic. And it's wild because it impacts every single one of us. And that group of people that don't really know what's going on, I wouldn't say we don't know what's going on, but we struggle with our relationship with money a little bit more. I would be willing to bet that that group of people is a large majority of the population, So I want to talk about the emotions behind money, because I have always known the logical right steps. I wouldn't say have always known, but I entered the banking world around 1920, and I got education through that job. So I knew how to build my credit. I knew what good credit looked like. I knew how to save money. I knew what a healthy financial picture looked like because I looked at other people's finances all day long. But when it came to my own actions, it was my emotions were running the show, right? So I consciously knew what I should be doing, and then I did the opposite. And then that made me feel so much guilt and shame. And, it just made me feel it compounded the issue. And I think that kept me in those patterns for so much longer because of the way that I was feeling about it. So how do our emotions influence our financial decisions? Let's dive into that, because I think that is the most fascinating component out of all of this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your example really highlighted, I think, the two big pieces to this. And one is like how our brains are wired. Um, and two is the fact there's this, societal comparison and how we grow up and how that really impacts and influences our relationship with money, good or bad. So we just talk about like the kind of the science psychology of it. What I always say to every member who kind of starts with habit is we kind of need to remove um, this saying that we have, which is often, I'm just bad with money. Like, how many of us just say, I'm just bad with it,
Mm-hmm.
as if it's some sort of personality defect. And the reality is that almost all of us are wired to be bad with money because as humans, spending is a very tangible, kind of real time gratification. And instant gratification is an impulse in our brains. And I think I said this to you the first time we chatted, but if you think about our caveman, if you were someone who abstained from instant gratification, meaning you stumbled upon a fruit tree and had a couple of figs and then saved them for later, you probably didn't make it because everybody else was, a feast or famine. And so if they had the opportunity to consume, they would consume as much as they could. And so evolutionarily, it was good for us to be impulsive. And so if you think about today, oftentimes when I work with people who, struggle with spending, and it might not just be impulse spending, but it's just, you spend money without really being mindful about it. That's just your brain doing what it's designed to do. And marketers know this. And so there's a $1 billion industry designed around taking advantage of what's happening in your brain. And so I share that to sort of not say, oh, there's nothing we can do. There's actually a ton you can do. But understanding that means that And you just need to understand that psychology so you can learn how to work around it and, in a way, use the same tools that marketers have been using for decades.
Wow. I think I actually got that in the first email. So, a little insight into the platform that Jessica has. Every single day, you get an email, and it basically talks about some component of the emotions behind money. And I think that was the first email I received, and it helped me have so much compassion for myself because I think, especially when you grow up with a lot of scarcity, there's this deeply rooted subconscious belief that there's not going to be enough. And so, that can really contribute to the impulse spending. And yeah, it's like there's always this fear that there's not going to be enough, or it's not going to be here tomorrow, so you spend everything that you have. It's really difficult to save because you don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, type of thing. So I think that talking about the emotions and the psychology behind spending is so important because I don't think a lot of us understand that, and then I think we feel guilt about impulse spending. And for me anyway, I just always felt like, okay, there's something wrong with me. Like I can't get this under control. And I didn't feel like I could talk about it. I spent my entire life not talking about it. I didn't talk about it with my romantic partners. I didn't talk about it with my therapist. I didn't talk about it with my family or friends until this last month when I blasted it all to the world. It was the first time I had talked about it with anybody. And so then when you're feeling guilt and shame, you're trying to self-soothe, AKA here comes the spending. So for the still talking about like the emotions behind it, I'm thinking about my own spending habits. And I think sometimes, especially because like during the COVID years, I was very isolated and I was in a very unhealthy relationship, and I lived out in the country with this man, and I was very, very, very depressed. And so it was almost like this dopamine. You know what I mean? It wasn't even about scarcity. It wasn't about anything other than I was seeking this. I was trying to feel better. And I would momentarily, like when I would spend, like, of course, I'd get a little bit of anxiety, but when the package arrived, very momentarily, I felt better. And so I also felt like I used overspending as a way to cope.
Yeah. It's a really easy, I love that you shared that because that is such a good example of the psychology of what we're talking about. Like craving a dopamine hit is exactly what happens. It becomes a coping mechanism. Shopping, spending. I hate shopping. I feel like that's a very gendered word, but spending money is a very easy coping mechanism to use. It's accessible. And you're right, like we get joy from it. I went through a phase where I was really struggling with spending when I had my first job and I was on the road all the time. And it's like I had an hour to myself between, 11 and midnight. And I'd be sitting in my hotel room. And all I really wanted was to go home and get mail. I just loved getting mail. And and so that was, my self soothe too. And so that really, really deeply resonates. And there's when we kind of talk about this stuff, there's the okay, well, how do you recognize that and then train yourself to seek alternatives like other dopamine hits that actually might self-soothe. So I actually just posted about this on TikTok today, but I have a member who just signed up who had just had a baby, and she was like, okay, we got to get our spending in check. We now have a family of three, and she was tracking her spending for about a month. And we got on a call to kind of reflect on it. And her big epiphany was that she was spending money on a lot of, things we would kind of define as self-care, like Botox and new makeup and just, both products and services. And she said what she realized was she was spending on all of these things because she was really struggling with her identity as a new mom and feeling beautiful because her body had changed. And what was actually, I think, super powerful is she was able to articulate what things she was spending on that actually did make her feel better and things that were really just band-aids, those sort of temporary dopamine. And why I share that example is I think going back to the shame thing, a lot of the time when we talk about money, it's this binary, all spending is bad, all savings is good. And that's not what we're here to talk about. And I think part of why we have a hard time talking about money is because we all compare ourselves and think that we all need to be the same. And the reality is that we all have different values. And so if you can take if you can define what you want your life to look like and you define what your values are, then you can be really intentional and spend your money or funnel your money in those directions. And so she realized that there were some things like a personal trainer and some of like the cosmetic stuff that actually really did make her feel good. And so she's like, I'm going to spend on that guilt free. All this other stuff is just coping that isn't helping me. So knowing that now I can deal with it. And I've gone on a total tangent, but I hope that like kind of illustrates the point you're making around how the emotions can bubble up, and even just becoming aware of them is really.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, tangents are always welcome here. I always go on tangents. But second of all, I think that is so powerful because, I mean, I look back in my years from 2020 to 2022, early 2022, when I was struggling the most with my mental health. Yeah, I was spending money on Botox and fillers and like so many things, trying to change clothes and just spending in a way in an attempt to feel better. But I love the mindset shift that not all spending is bad, because I think, you know, especially going public with my story, I have so many people that are like, Dave Ramsey, like you just need to cut out all spending. And basically, the other day, somebody told me I shouldn't be spending money on dishwasher, stuff, because I should be hand washing my dishes because I don't have money. And I was like, I just am not going to live that way. You know, I think there are limitations. Of course, I'm willing to cut back on my spending, but some things like dishwasher, whatever the, I can't, liquid you put it, the dishwasher. So like, that's okay that I spend the money on that. And I think that's a very beautiful point that you bring to our attention, that it's about just identifying where you're spending the money and then deciding what is of value to you and what is actually something that you want to continue your spending on. Because in my spending history, I just didn't look at any of it. Like I never analyzed what was good or what was making me feel better or what was unnecessary, because I just avoided all of it. So I'm curious why you think talking about money is so emotionally charged. Why does it get people so
Ooh,
upset?
I mean, I'd honestly love to get your thoughts on this too, because what I like found so powerful about when you shared this, I saw how much people engaged with what you were sharing. And I think it shows how much people are craving to talk about this that are very afraid to. My 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 thoughts on this are, I think money is just taboo. I think culturally it's taboo. It's considered tacky to talk about money. Like if you think about, you know, people going out to dinner and you're splitting the check, it feels very uncomfortable to sit there and talk about it, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's just cultural. And that can be, from a wide perspective, but also you probably have your own microcosm of what's culturally acceptable from your parents. And so that's why we all are kind of navigating our own what is culturally acceptable boundaries as we start interacting with other people, because we get out of the family and are trying to mesh those things together. I think about it a lot like mental health. Pre-COVID 10 years ago, no one talked about going to therapy. It was like something, other people deal with this, other people struggle with this, but I don't. I do think the pandemic really accelerated the conversation about mental health to the point now that everyone talks about going to the therapy. It's very open. The phrase my therapist says is ubiquitous. It's very okay. And I feel like talking about money is where therapy was 10 years ago. And I think part of it is as a society recognizing that money is not in its own class. It actually really impacts our whole health and wellness. Like you think about money every day. Money is, every time you make a money decision, you're making a values decision. And your values decisions impact your happiness. Money is the number one driver of divorce. It's the number one driver of stress. And we're starting to kind of have conversations. So I think we're getting there. But the more I think people are willing to be open and vulnerable and share what they're going through is what's going to catalyze that conversation, just like you did. Because if you can model, hey, this is what I'm doing and this is what I'm going through, it gives other people who kind of feel alone in a vacuum someone to see who looks like them and is like, oh, actually, I thought I was alone, like you just said at the beginning of the conversation, but actually I'm not. And that's really empowering.
Yeah, I think our upbringing plays a big role. And I think of like my parents' generation, it wasn't appropriate. It was rude. It wasn't appropriate to talk about finances. And I know the fact that I'm even talking about my finances online, my mom is just like, honey, why do you need to do that? It's so outside of her comfort zone. But like you said, I also think it's where you grow up. I have a girlfriend who grew up in the South. She lives in Portland now, and we've talked about money. And she said in her friend group in the South, you never discuss money. You never discuss money. You would never ask somebody, how did you buy this? Or you don't inquire at all. So even where you're at in the country plays a different role, and how appropriate it is to talk about finances. But yeah, sharing my story publicly is a little bit of a social experiment, I think, of sorts. And I would say that it's been about 90% positive, which I knew when I released the video that I wasn't going to be able to control how people responded to my story. And you just have to be at peace with that if you're going to share something very vulnerable. But I think for a lot of people, and even for my own journey, it's been so powerful and so healing to just hear other people say, me too. I mean, think of like
Yeah.
the Me Too movement. And I know this isn't about the same topic, but it's just somebody saying, me too, sis, like me too. And it makes you feel so much less alone. It allows you to have so much compassion for yourself. It allows you to forgive yourself, I think. And I think that's the first step you have to take to really create and cultivate change in your life, is to have forgiveness for yourself and say, you know what? I'm in this current situation, and maybe I'm not super proud of it. Maybe I don't love that I'm here, but I forgive myself. And I thank every prior version of me for doing everything that she needed to do to get through. And now we're going to create change moving forward. But I do just think it's one of those topics. It's like sex and money. There's like certain topics that are still like so off limits in our society. And every single human experiences or interacts with them in some way. And I just don't get it. I don't get
You
it.
know, one thing you just shared that gave me like an aha was how all of these things kind of spiral with each other. Because if we all don't talk about money, then there is a unifying narrative in society of how you're supposed to do things. And so, this is the narrative that we've all been taught of how you manage your money. And there's a right way and a wrong way. And because nobody talks about their own personal experiences, it's just there's a projection. And then if you feel like you're doing it wrong, you don't talk about it. And so you don't talk about it. You don't get any input. And so you keep spiraling. And what you have now done is sort of cut that off and said, this way wasn't working for me. It's not I'm a failure. It's I have my own stuff and I'm going to handle it in my way. And, I think about like, I think sex is a really good example of that. Like it's very taboo, and how people manage that in relationships. There's actually a lot of layers, and everybody has a different relationship with it, and defining your own is what's really important. But until people talk about it and kind of feel comfortable enough to be, or even have permission and to give yourself permission to come up with a different plan or a different, system that works for you, you're just going to sit there and beat yourself up and feel bad and compare. It's like all you're doing is comparing yourself to what you think everyone else is doing. Because if you get underneath, there's actually so many other ways you can exist and be happy and financially healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So now that we've kind of talked about the emotions behind it, right? It's a very emotional subject. And if you want to cultivate change in your life, I think it's super important that you acknowledge the emotions behind it, whether it's emotions that you're feeling about your current experience, the emotions that are driving your spending habits or your financial habits. If somebody's in a financial situation where they don't feel super secure, like you said, it's a part of our well-being. And I think a lot of us overlook it. How does somebody go about creating change?
Yeah, it's the hardest thing is starting. Um, I have I can't tell you how many people come to me and they say, "Hey, there's this person in my life who could really use it." But and not to make too close a parallel to, I mean, it is like addiction psychology, but I don't want to say like, oh, some people who just maybe spend a little too much are the same as people who are really struggling with addiction. Some are, but I don't want to blanket it. But similarly to when people are saying, hey, there's this person I really love who's struggling with addiction, we all know that they're not going to start to heal until they choose for themselves. And so I use that analogy to say it is truly the hardest part to start. Because, like you said in the beginning, you have to be able to exercise some self compassion to sort of have to look yourself in the mirror and say, oh, like I've been struggling, or some of the things I have been doing, I'm not super happy with, or I'm not super proud of. And you have to be able to distance yourself from that. And that's really, really hard. And I think the way I like to think about it is just one step at a time, or, any step is better than doing nothing. And so for you, it might look different than for someone else. And, with Habit, we kind of give you the ability to do any of these things, and hopefully you can do all of them. But if one thing works for you, that's great. What we oftentimes do with a lot of people is we just tell people to start tracking their spending. It sounds horrible. It sounds absolutely horrible, but it actually can feel really good. And what we like to do is just focus on the habit of tracking. Don't go and set a budget, because if you set a budget, you're instantly going to break it, because I guarantee you don't know where your money is going, which is sort of the point of the exercise. But just try to get in the habit of, we call it a money mindfulness moment, where every day you just take 1 minute and just like look at your spending, or like look where your money went, and take a second to reflect on how it made you feel. And again, it's not about whether the money, whether you actually should have bought something, or you start doing that beat up game. No, the whole point is just pay attention. And naturally, just by doing that, you'll spend less, just because if you're aware of where your money is going, you start having opportunity cost conversations. But without prompting, you will start noticing patterns in how your spending is rooted into your emotions and your value system. And what I tell people to do is to try to notice when spending makes you feel a little like uncomfortable, and be curious about that. Instead of trying to push that away, which is what a lot of us do, embrace that with curiosity. That part of yourself, why are you kind of shrinking away from that? Because the answers are not going to be the same. Maybe it's, oh, I feel guilty about that because, honestly, the way my parents always talked about eating out is that eating out is a total waste. And so anytime I spend money on takeout, I beat myself up. But actually, this really works for me and this is fun. And so that's a learning. Another one could be like the learning my other member had, that, spending was just a way of getting a dopamine. And so your patterns are going to be so dependent on you. But if you can start just building the awareness, you'll naturally start having that conversation with yourself. And then from there, you can start taking action on those learnings. So, oh, I'm struggling with this thing, so now I need to figure out a plan to address it. Or now that I know where my spending is going, now I know where I need to cut down or build a plan that works for me. But you can't do any of that until you have some awareness and like some data. Because what most people do is they set a budget and they're like, oh yeah, this is my optimal budget based on what I think could work. And then of course you don't follow it. You don't think about it for 30 days. And then you break it. And then you feel horrible. And then you feel like a failure. And then you go back down that spiral. So if there's a way you can baby step it and get some motivation, that's what's going to help you snowball.
I'm thinking about the fact that I used to be a fitness coach, and when I would teach people about their nutrition, the first thing I would have them do for 30 days is track their food intake, so we could get a feel for what they actually were eating. Because it's very easy in your mind to be like, yeah, I'm eating plenty of protein. But then you actually track your intake, and then a lot of people are like, whoa, I'm getting like 30 grams of protein in a day. And I'm way off from where I actually thought my intake actually was. And then when you have that data of what your existing habits are, it's so much easier to create change. So I just had the aha moment of, I'm like, you're doing the exact same thing with your finances. And it's something I have never done until the last couple of weeks. And I have to say, your platform I love, because it integrates my accounts. So then every day I get a text at the end of the day, and it's like, you spent whatever my spending was, which has been very minimal lately because you guys know I'm in a situation. But I love the idea and I loved going in and being able to rate, like, how are you feeling? Because what you said about actually sitting with the activation in your body is so important. And I think this could be applied to any area of our life. But when we experience a trigger of some sort, instead of suppressing it and saying, this is uncomfortable and I don't want to look at it or deal with it, actually being curious about what that activation is there for. What is that trigger there for? What is your body trying to communicate to you? And I had a conversation with a girlfriend before I went public online. I called up basically all of my girlfriends and was like, hey, by the way, I have lots of debt and I've never told you before, because I wanted them to hear it from me before I blasted it out to the internet. And most of them said, hey, me too. But a girlfriend and I started having a conversation about credit card spending and how when you spend on your credit card, you'd feel the discomfort in your body. You would feel yourself get triggered. You would feel for me, it was like a pit in my stomach. And that was my body telling me, like, hey, this actually isn't safe. This isn't in alignment. But instead of actually sitting with those feelings, examining those feelings, which I was doing in almost every other area of my life, right? Feel triggered, I'd be curious about it. But when it came to money, I would just suppress it. And I almost felt like I would disassociate for a moment. Like I would completely detach
Mm.
from my emotions momentarily when I would swipe that card. And I think when using the plastic credit cards to spend money or shopping online, there's like this detachment from what's actually taking place. So I think that's such a beautiful place to start, instead of saying, okay, let's overhaul all of your financial habits overnight. Because again, I know how to help people implement habits when it comes to like the fitness and the health world. I would never say, let's change your entire life overnight. Let's change all of your habits. Like tomorrow, start going to the gym, drinking water, tracking your food, prepping your meals. Like if I asked somebody to do that in 1 week, they'd fall off, they'd feel like a failure, and they'd never start again. And so I like that approach of just saying, let's start with awareness. And I shared this with you and I've shared this with my audience online, but something that I've started doing is every day having what I call a finance date with myself. And I have been trying to make it a very fun and pleasurable experience. And what I'm trying to do is rewire my brain to be so it's excited about looking at my finances. And so there's not discomfort in my body. And there is like, especially when I first started, I would sit down and I would feel my nervous system activate, and I'd have to self-soothe and say, it's safe for me to look at this. It's safe for me to look at this. But with enough time and enough data points of me saying, oh, looking at my finances and exposing myself to my finances is safe and it's actually kind of fun, you're rewriting that narrative. So I think that's such a beautiful place to start. Just, hey, take a look at what you're actually doing, because most of us don't even know.
Well, you're totally like going back to what we talked about the brain earlier. You are literally retraining your brain, and that's that's kind of like those next steps when you think about, okay, here when you identify what you're struggling with, then you can start to pattern recognize. So
Mm-hmm.
I have another member who struggles with. She's really stressed right now for a variety of reasons. And when she gets hyper stressed, the self soothe is the spending. And when she was able to identify that, she was like, okay, when I'm really stressed, what are other things that are actually going to help me de-stress? And for her, it was just taking her dog for a walk. And then
Mm-hmm.
when her husband came home, getting a really good hug. And she, similar to you, rewiring your brain to be able to deal with money and like sit down and make it fun and retrain your brain into thinking it's fun and almost gamifying it. She was replacing the dopamine hit of spending with the dopamine hit per person and actually self-soothing. And those are both like really helpful tactics. I mean, what's amazing what you're doing, it's called habit stacking, where you essentially find something you really enjoy and then you stack it with something else. And then over time, your brain associates like dealing with money with fun stuff. And then over time, you'll see your credit card debt go down and your savings go up. And then you can get really addicted to that. But I think that's such a cool example of some of the applications of this like theoretical psychological stuff. Um, but you're right, it's exactly the same as personal training. It's exactly the same as nutrition. I actually started Noom around the same time I was starting to develop it. And I think what's so cool about it is if you can remove the judgment from your data and you just say, the information is just data. I actually learned a lot because I didn't think I was consuming that much, but I had no idea how many calories or carbs were in certain things that I was consuming. And so while I thought I was eating really healthily, I just wasn't aware of how much I was spending my calories on things. And I think that's the other thing about the tracking of the spending and removing the guilt. Some of us just don't realize how much stuff costs. And again, with the credit card, you just swipe and in any moment you're like, okay, that's what it costs. But we're not sitting there and kind of adding it up. And tracking helps you sort of add things up, and it also helps you think through the opportunity cost of those purchases. And ultimately, the money, that's what is really helpful with money mindfulness, is making sure that every single time you make a money choice, it is more and more in line with your values. And then the guilt and the shame goes away. And then you feel really, really
I
empowered.
love this analogy of the food intake to the spending, because I'm just thinking about, okay, so say you're tracking your food intake. I used to say this to my clients. If you're tracking your food intake, but you're not tracking the like handful of pretzels here and the bites here and the bites here, like all of those add up really, really quickly. And so you can come to me and say, no, Lana, I'm hitting my numbers, but you aren't accounting for all of these little things that seem very minor that can make or break, or not make or break, but have a big impact on your progress. And so I think with the credit card spending, I know from my journey anyway, it was little purchases. It wasn't my big purchases I planned for in some way. It was the little purchases. I almost had this threshold. I felt like if it was under maybe like $75, I think that threshold grew with time. And that's a whole other conversation about, I think we could talk about like the addictive component of it. It's like your threshold for that emotion increases with time, right? So your threshold for debt increases with time, and your threshold for what is like, you know, menial spending gets larger. 18-year-old Lana probably wouldn't just put $75. $75 is a lot more to her than, current day Lana.
Totally.
But it was little purchases over time, and it snowballed so quickly. And it's, again, just not having the awareness around it and just being completely disconnected from it. And I love the concept of just detaching yourself from the data. And I think it's so important if you're in a financial situation right now where it feels very overwhelming and it feels very stressful, and you go to bed at night and you're anxious and you wake up and you're anxious, try to expose yourself to the data with detachment, because if you avoid it, things will never change. And that is true across the board with any area of your life, is you can't operate in avoidance forever and then expect things to be different.
Yeah. And this is going to be sending me down a complete therapy route. And I will disclaimer this, that I'm not a therapist, but I've learned this from my therapist. And I actually think it's really applicable to what we're talking about. There's this concept called parts therapy, which is, if you've seen the movies Inside and Out, that's effectively what it's based on. But the idea is that there are these different voices or these different parts of yourself that are oftentimes competing to be heard. And there are some that you develop in your kind of formative years in your childhood, and they're, developed coping mechanisms. And as you get older, your need for them changes, but they're fighting to be heard. And oftentimes when we experience anxiety or that discomfort, it very often is one of those parts. And going back to that, having that curious conversation with yourself, if you're going to bed at night and you're stressed about money, or the analogy I use, if you're someone who gets their credit card statement and like actively avoids it, if you can even notice when you're doing that, and instead of trying to shove that emotion down in the sand, can you sort of make space for that emotion? And I know discomfort is uncomfortable, but if you can embrace that with curiosity and say, hey, like, part of me who seems to be really uncomfortable, what's going on here? Where is this coming from? What are we afraid of? And oftentimes it's feeling guilt or feeling shame, or knowing I've done something wrong, or having to kind of face these facts. And when you just say out loud what you're afraid of, it actually doesn't sound so scary. Um, and so just doing that is a huge first step. If you can just do that, which you again modeled here. But it's easy to talk about here, but it isn't easy. And so that again is like a higher level of awareness because you're even aware of your own feelings in your body. Um, but it'll probably bring up some things that you didn't even realize were kind of happening internally. And it might sound crazy to have a conversation with yourself, but the other part of yourself that is brave and courageous and self compassionate can then say to that other part, I hear you. I know it's really scary, but we are also going to be okay. And if we keep avoiding this, you're never going to feel better. So we need to take a look at us so we can do something. And yes, I have this conversation with myself all the time. I'm always talking to
I love that. I think that's so beautiful. I have this visual of my parts in my brain where it's like these treasure chests or these big,
Ooh,
chests where like something wants to come out and then you like for a long time you're just slamming it shut. Like I'm not ready to look at it. But then you eventually reach a breaking point. And for me, that was when I tipped over into the $40,000 in debt where I was like, I got to open this chest up. I got to see what it's been trying to tell me because I cannot live this way anymore. So it's just allowing yourself to say, okay, no matter how uncomfortable this is, I know that I'm safe and I just need to face this. And I think ultimately that's the first step is just saying, okay, let me take a look at this honestly and go from there. So if somebody's in a state of financial stress right now, we've talked about facing their current situation, finding forgiveness, finding some detachment and separation from the data, really starting to track their spending. Can you share a little bit more about your platform and the different features that it offers in addition to tracking your spending?
yeah. So you tee this up perfectly with the examples of nutrition and exercise because what I like to say about Habit Money is it's like the personal trainer for personal finance. And so we use very much the same methodology for money. So it's two parts. It combines technology, so an with a human coach if you want to avail yourself of that. So again, it's sort of a menu of things and you choose what works for you. So the app enables you to track your spending, have your money mindfulness moment every day. It will text you. You can decide what time of day you want to do it. So again, that's part of the ritualization. So you said you have your finance date with yourself. If you do that at the same time every day, you can have the app align with that just to kind of give you that friendly nudge. Um, and then over time, it sort of takes you through the steps. So it's not all overwhelming at once. So it's designed to kind of monitor where you are in your journey. So first it's tracking, then it will text you kind of like a little report that tells you, we call it the feelings report. And so it actually highlights for you what you've ranked as things you feel good about and things you don't. So you can start to have that awareness conversation with yourself. And then after a period of time, we'll say, okay, it seems like you have enough information. Are you ready to set a budget? And then every single month, it's going to kind of prompt you to go through that cycle. It also pays attention to when maybe you're falling off the wagon or back on, and we'll kind of check in on you. On top of that, there is a human coach, if you want, who is available to be a little bit more hands on. So, a lot of people kind of show up and they're, what you're supposed to do, but you're overwhelmed and you're like, where do I start? Do I pay off all this debt? Do I establish an emergency savings fund? But also I need to invest for retirement. And you're just like, ugh. That's what a coach can do is sort of sit down, take in all of your information and help you put together a plan that works for you. It's oftentimes really helpful for people who have multiple kinds of debt, like credit card debt, student loans. It's like all these things that just sort of weigh down on your shoulders. Having someone just sort of take in that information and help put together a plan for you can be really helpful. And they also can help you process some of these emotions and talk about some of the more tactical steps or things for you to try. And so it can be a little bit more customized. So if going it alone feels hard or you are feeling stuck, that's where having the conversation with the coach can be really helpful. And they're available via text. So it's kind of like BetterHelp. You can text us anytime. Or if you want to hop on a call, that's also available. So it's a really kind of like choose your own adventure. But the idea is that it's personalized, it's motivating, and it's habit building. And it's recognizing, unfortunately, there's no quick fix. Just like this so well with nutrition and exercise, we all want the magic pill that just changes everything. And it it takes some discipline and it takes some work. And this is a proven system that works. And we're here to just try and make that as easy and as accessible as possible.
It's like a personal trainer for your finances. And I love it so much because I think we've touched on this already, but I know for myself, I've invested in my personal training, my health. I've invested in my emotional health. I invest in my spiritual health. I invest in every component of my wellness except this major one. So thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today. If our listeners want to connect with you and learn more about Habit Money, where can they find you?
Yeah, so they can find us on our website at habitmoney.com. We also are all over social media. So we're on both TikTok and Instagram at Join Habit Money, where I talk a lot about this and share some tips on money as well as, different ways you can manage your finances. If you go to our website, again, habitmoney.com, you can sign up for the app there. And again, when you sign up, you have the option to go straight into the app and kind of jump in self-serve. Or if you're in a place of feeling overwhelmed, the first thing you can do is schedule a call with a coach. Everyone gets 30 days free. And the reason for this is because I know it sounds counterintuitive to maybe pay for something when you're trying to save money. And so we really want our members to feel like they're getting the value out of it before they start paying for it. And we have several different options available based on your goals, your needs, and like your financial situation. So I always say to people, if you're paying for something and you're not getting the value, that's a problem. And so my first and foremost goal is to make sure that you're feeling better your money. And so that's the goal. And then you can figure out like, is the investment right for you?
I love it. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for sharing this with your audience. And also just thank you for being another voice that's changing the conversation about money. I really think that's the catalyst for being able to do any of this is having more and more people do the brave thing like you and just laying it out on the table. And I'm sure you've already seen this from all of the people who've responded to what you're sharing, but it really is making a difference in people.
Thank you. And once I've gotten through the stage of tracking my spending, maybe we can have another conversation in the future about getting a little bit more into the nitty gritty of the habits. You know what I mean? I think today it's like the emotional component because it's the first thing you've got to address. But yeah, thank you so much. And we'll chat soon. Okay.
Sounds good.